Welcome to the tutorial series on Dominator. This one's going to be all about rendering, like actually creating HTML with classes and divs and lists and all that good stuff. Okay, so last we left off, we were looking at the append DOM method of Dominator, which attaches a bit of HTML like to an existing DOM element, right? So in this case, the body of the DOM of the document, right? Okay, so if we look at the append DOM method itself, like actually jump to the definition, we could see that it takes a node and a DOM. The node is coming from WebSys, which is like the Rust WASM bindings to the web API. And the DOM is a Dominator struct, right? So one is coming from the native web API and the other is coming from Dominator. And we could see if we jump in at node, we could see it brings us to the definition in WebSys and even links to the MDN docs for the actual element. Ultimately, even though we're going to do everything through Dominator and keep it very simple, it is good to know how to work with WebSys directly. And we are going to want to access the elements and get type information and sometimes even call methods on WebSys itself. So let's go ahead and bring it in. But the way we want to do it is we only want to bring in certain features of WebSys because really it creates bindings for the entire web API. And in fact, we'll just bring in window as our only feature that we need right now. All right, and now we can do things like, let's say, let window equals WebSys window unwrap. And if we look at the type, we could see that it's a WebSys window. And now we can get a document from that window. Okay, and now that we have our document, we can get our body from the document by just, document.body.unwrap. And this body element is the WebSys node, so we can actually pass it directly to append DOM. Like it's exactly the same as what Dominator was giving us the helper for. So that's the first part of append DOM, the node. And so we're going to attach something to the body. But what is it that we're attaching? Well, if we go back and look at append DOM again, we'll see the second thing is a DOM. And as it happens, if we go and look at Dominator's DOM struct, we could see it's actually just a wrapper around another node element. So we could create this DOM element by just passing in a node, like again, creating it manually. So let's do that. Again, this is not the way we're going to actually write Dominator code, just to kind of get a sense of what's going on. So we do let lm equals document.create element. Then we do let dom equals dom new. And of course, we're in the Dominator namespace. And then we just give it the element. We do have to do one more thing. We have to convert this element into the node itself. WebSys isn't going to, or Rust really isn't going to infer that for us. But by calling .unchecked into, it can do that conversion for us. So let's comment out our nice Dominator HTML macro version, which we'll get back to in a minute. And let's just give it our DOM struct. And we can see that it works. I mean, there's nothing on the screen because it's just a div element, but it does work. Let's prove to ourselves that we can actually see this on the screen though. So we have to add text to our element, not the DOM itself. Okay, so we go up to our element and we call .set text content. Again, this is all just raw WebSys stuff. And boom, we can see it on the screen. So this is pretty much equivalent to like if we were to do it in JavaScript, right? With like the raw JavaScript API. I mean, that is pretty much exactly what the WebSys bindings are. And so we're just kind of duplicating that process of if you weren't using a framework and you were to just use raw vanilla JS to like update the DOM. Now, the problem is that this just does not scale, right? Like you don't want to have to manually, when a user clicks a button and then you want to have to go and like find a reference to that element and then update the text on the inside and all of this like passing around IDs and holding in memory like the exact DOM element, like it just doesn't scale. Okay, so we're within Dominator, we're accepting that, we're not going to go update our elements. How do we update this DOM struct? Like if we look at it, we can see there's actually no methods on it, right? It's just a wrapper that doesn't really let you do anything. So while DOM is like this sealed struct, what we really want is we want DOM builder, which uses the builder pattern to let us call all these different methods. And then at the end, we're going to get a DOM out of it. But we do all of our updating of the DOM struct with the builder, with DOM builder. Okay, so let's create our DOM from our DOM builder, but we're going to call our methods on DOM builder. So let's say we didn't set the text on the element, and instead we want to set the text via our DOM builder. Okay, so we say .text, and let's say from a DOM builder to a DOM. So are we done? Like you'd think that's it, right? But no, because we're using the builder pattern, right? So like it doesn't know what we want to build on it next. So we still only have a DOM builder. What we have to do is then say .into DOM to get our DOM, like to kind of seal the builder and tell it that we're finished. Now, the problem is that when we're doing this approach of doing this all manually, and again, we're going to clean all this up. Like everything we're looking at is really that one line below. But when we're doing it manually, we have to give it the correct types and help Rust infer the types that we're working with exactly, like what kind of element we're operating over. HTML div element, for example, is a different kind of element than just HTML element or HTML input element. And these differences are going to be important later. So right now we're being a little bit more verbose than we have to be, but we do want to bring this in to our features on WebSys, like specifically here, HTML div element. We'll see later that probably the most useful one that we're going to want to import is going to be HTML input element, but we're not there yet, right? For right now, we're just rendering static HTML. Okay, so we fixed up all the types, and now we could see that it works. We could see the text on the screen, exactly like we expected. But this is all super unwieldy, ridiculously verbose, and let's be honest, it's just not fun, right? So instead of all this, we could just use this one line and this HTML macro, which is amazing. So we can go and look at all the DOM builder methods, and let's say we wanted to, let's say we wanted to set the style of this element, right? Okay, so first of all, let's get rid of all that stuff that we don't need. That was just for learning about what's going on. We are never going to need that ever again. Now that we're inside of our HTML macro, we can just call our DOM builder method. So let's say .style, right? And we'll give it a color of red. Boom. All right. And now, you know what? Let's go even further and give it another style of a font size of XX large. And wow, amazing, right? And again, there's all these methods that you can call on DOM builder, like everything you need for rendering. Okay, so all this .style, it can get a little unwieldy. So what we can do is we can pull in the styles, and actually also adders, and there's other macros that Dominator provides to make things a little bit simpler. So we can just do .styles and just kind of refactor this a little bit to give it just sort of a key value pair. And oh yeah, that's .styles. Got to be careful there. Okay, and now it's kind of just like an object or object-like syntax. And in fact, if the key does not have a dash in it, you don't have to give it the quotes. You could just use the regular name without quotes. But if it does have a dash, like here, we do need to add the quotes around it, around the key. Of course, the value is always a string. So just like we have this for styles, we also have this for attributes, and that's what the adders macro is. And we could also just put it all in one line. So now it's starting to feel maybe not visually what HTML or JSX would look like, but in terms of verbosity and just how many characters on the screen, and it kind of looks around in the same ballpark. But it isn't actually HTML, right? And it can sometimes be a little bit annoying to have to, if you have some sort of template or some snippets of code that are in HTML and you want to convert them over to Dominator syntax, it can be a little annoying to have to retype everything out. So there's this tool, you can see the link in the description, called HTML to Dominator string. And you can just paste in your HTML on the left and it'll spit out Dominator syntax on the right. And of course, the text that's there is just a sample text, and you can delete it and just add your own. So, we could bring in a input checkbox and kind of see that it converts it over the way you'd expect with attributes. And it could be especially useful for things like Tailwind, where you have a lot of classes and just a lot of text that you want to be able to convert over from HTML to Dominator syntax. Let's go back to the original style here and delete this macro and just bring in our .styles as we had it. Okay, so the next things we'd probably want to talk about rendering HTML would be how to add children and CSS and stuff like that. But let's take a little detour and talk about one of the really cool things we get by DOM builder being just like a regular Rust struct that we can pass around to functions. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we're going to import DOM builder itself so we can pass it to functions that take it and return it back out. And this is the so-called mixin pattern. So Dominator mixins are not a Rust language feature. It's just jargon for a function like DOM builder to DOM builder, and it's super powerful and awesome. Like it's really great. So let's say we want to have like a consistent style that we want to apply to a bunch of text. And I know what you're thinking, like let's just use CSS classes for this, and you're not wrong. And we will get to that later, but keep in mind that what we're talking about here is consistent things that we want to do to any DOM builder. So it could be reusing logic for when input text changes and things like that. But let's keep it simple for now with static HTML, and we're just going to talk about keeping consistent styles. So we're going to make this function make awesome text, and it's going to take in something we'll call B for DOM builder, and it's a DOM builder that's generic over any kind of HTML element, and it returns back a DOM builder of the same kind. Okay, so we're just going to refactor this a little bit. We're going to create our DOM on the outside, again, like we had before, but this time we're going to use it just to assign a variable to our HTML macro. And we're going to move our styles out of the HTML, out of the DOM builder there. We still want to keep the text, right? So the idea here is that we're just going to like make any HTML element with text into an HTML element with awesome text with our styling, right? So it's just a little bit of refactoring. So now we have our DOM element being assigned, so we just need to call make awesome text on it, right? Wrong. And this is a very important point, so pay attention. Okay, the HTML macro is returning back a DOM, but remember, make awesome text is taking a DOM builder. So this distinction between DOM being a sealed thing that gets rendered and appended to children versus DOM builder of how we like build up the inside of that DOM, those are two very, very different concepts. And so we can't just call make awesome text on our DOM. We have to call it on a DOM builder. So how do we do that? How do we like get at the DOM builder of the DOM? Well, the HTML macro is, like we said, a macro to help you like call these methods on a DOM builder, on its inner DOM builder. So all we have to do is call .apply and give it our function. And that's how you apply any mixin to the DOM builder. Again, mixin is our own jargon here for any function that kind of takes a DOM builder and gives back a DOM builder. You might find that might use mixins that take other parameters, and you can kind of like change the styling or change the logic of it on the inside. And you can apply different mixins. So you can have one that, changes the styles. You could have another that changes the logic and behavior of what happens inside of the DOM builder. Really, it's up to your imagination, and you can apply as many mixins as you want. And this isn't even getting into having higher level components and having children that are rendered under parents. This is just affecting the actual element itself. So it's also a bit more efficient. All right, but now let's get back to our regular how do we get HTML on the screen with Dominator. So the next thing we'd probably want to do would be to render children. Let's create ourselves a little UL element here. And then on the inside, we're going to add another HTML element. But that does not work, right? You can't just like stuff one HTML inside of another. Instead, what you have to do is you have to call .child. Okay, so now we have one child, and that's great, but what if you want multiple children? Well, you can do this just like with .style. You can do this, .child, and that's fine. But here, instead of needing a macro, what you have is you have .children. Okay, and so for .children, we'll give this a slice of our array. Wait, but that doesn't quite work because you have to give it something that can be turned into an into iterator of a borrow mute of a DOM, meaning the iterator's inner elements can be a mutable reference to a DOM. Child also requires that you give it something that can be a mutable reference to a DOM. In practice, usually these things are just owned DOM elements, like you're not actually giving it mutable references. But with children, that does come into play where you want to like have an iterator that's being mapped into these references. But we could also give it a vec or anything else that satisfies these traits. We could also assign it to a variable. We could use the whole iter tools crate and get all kinds of fancy custom structs that satisfy the trait. Really, sky's the limit. It's just pure Rust here. So let's go ahead and assign the children just like a vec of string slices. And then we'll go ahead and like map those strings into HTML elements and create the actual DOM children inside of the iterator map. So this also works. And then we could add another child up there. So because we've assigned children to a vec of these string slices, and we're just calling .map as like, a combinator on the iterator, we could also just, give these different names and get the numbers out of there and call .enumerate on the iterator and use the index as a value that's given to us by the enumerate combinator. Just got to get the syntax right here. But this is just pure Rust, right? We're just using the native functionality of Rust itself to deal with our rendering logic, which, as you can imagine, is very powerful. Okay, now we're not going to go into full-on components here, like with interactivity and all that kind of stuff. But let's say we wanted to just like abstract this into a function that gives us something back, right? Okay, so render element is going to take index and our text, and it's going to return. Well, you know what? Let's ask, what should it return, right? Should it be DOM or DOM builder? So the answer in this case is DOM, right? It's the thing that gets rendered to the screen. DOM builder is how we build it up, and then it gets sealed into the DOM, which gets rendered. So it's going to return a DOM, but on the inside of this function, we have our DOM builder. So, okay, so that works. And now we have this abstraction. We could do all kinds of stuff inside of this function, depending on the index, we could have different logic that does different things, right? It's now abstracted and we're totally free to implement whatever we want on the inside. For example, we can apply our mixin. So let's .apply make awesome text. Okay, great. So now we have our awesome text. I think there's just one more thing to cover in terms of just like pure rendering, without getting into interactivity and reactivity and all that sort of stuff. In terms of pure rendering, we still have to talk about CSS and styles. Like how do we use classes and style sheets and all that sort of stuff. So for starters, just to set ourselves up, let's duplicate this function out and we'll call one of them inline styles and the other one class, right? Just so that we can kind of keep it there and work with either of them. So then we'll switch it to use our make awesome text class version. All right, and for starters, in our make awesome text class, let's just say that it's using this class of blah. So if this class blah already exists, well, there's nothing really to talk about in terms of style sheets, right? Like we've imported it, it's done, right? It's defined somewhere else. But what we can do is we can actually define style sheets inside of Dominator using this style sheet macro. So we can give it our .styles on the inside. And where this is really useful, to be honest, is when we have style signal, which we're not going to go into now, but where the styles themselves dynamically react to changing state. And so the style sheet kind of like updates itself, and it's really cool. But that's the use case where you'd want to define style sheets inside of Dominator, if not just for convenience. Okay, so that's for style sheets. But let's say you want to use classes, but you're worried about like namespace conflicts and you don't want to rely on BEM. You want to like define classes in the dynamic logic of the app and have it like generate names and save all the conflict issues, right? So Dominator does allow you to define classes as well using the, you guessed it, class macro. Now, of course, you don't have to define any of this. You could use something like Tailwind with utility classes, but let's go ahead and look at how to define classes in Dominator. Okay, so let's create like my class and assign it with the class macro, and we'll do it inside of the render element function, right? And we can use the same styles that we've been using before. And you guessed it, when we get to reactivity, these styles can also dynamically update in reaction to state changes. Very cool, but we're not there yet. So we just do my class equals class macro, and then we can use our same styles that we used before. And now we can just say dot class, and we need to give it the name of this class. But wait a second, we don't actually have the name, right? Like we have the variable, what's its name? It's like something that's generated dynamically under the hood. So how do we get the name from it? Well, what Dominator is actually doing is it is generating the class under the hood, but what it's giving us back is the string name of the class, right? And so if we log this out, we'll actually see that because we're calling this render element function 3 times, it's going to generate a new name for a class each time. Okay, so we want to make this now a static so that it doesn't like re-render it each time. We can try and make it a reference to a string, but it's static, so that's not really going to work. We could try and say that we're just giving it back a string itself, but again, it's a static. That's also not going to work. So what we really need to do is we want to like wrap it in a lazy, because it is going to be generated dynamically, right? It's not a const. And so we need it to be lazily created. So we could bring in the once cell create, which lets us do things like this, like kind of dynamically generate static things. It's an amazing create. Definitely check it out. And so yeah, now that we've wrapped this in a lazy once cell, it'll just like create it the first time it's accessed, and then from then on we have static access to it. In our log, we'll just log out the inner dereferenced value, and in class, we'll give it a reference to that like kind of string slice. And now we can see that when we log it out, it's rendered 3 times, like we could see 3 there, but it all has the same name, right? Like it's the same class definition. We're just reusing it each time. So much more efficient to do it this way. So last thing about this, if we looked at the style sheet macro, you notice that we can use selectors, right? Like we're actually naming that part of the style sheet, and we have all the power of CSS selectors at our disposal. But with the class, we don't have that. Like there's nothing to name. There's no like selectors to work with. So instead, if we want to do things with that, we have to use the pseudo macro. Again, this is if you're defining your classes inside of Dominator. It's not necessary to do it this way. You could use whatever you want, like Tailwind, Sass, whatever on the outside. But if you do want to define your classes inside of Dominator, this is how you kind of like define pseudo selectors and things like that. And we can see that if we use the pseudo macro, we can add a hover rule, and we can like, change the text to turn blue when we hover over it. And it's a thing of beauty, right? And again, the cool thing about defining your classes and style sheets and stuff inside of Dominator is that you can use these signal methods to kind of like update parts of it when your state changes and react to it, which we'll get into later, but we're not quite there yet. All right, until next time, that's it for rendering in Dominator.